Good morning and welcome to Indian Democracy at Work with Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. We have another stimulating discussion with Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, popularly known as Dr. JP. Dr. JP is a physician by training and an ex-officer of the Indian Administrative Service and ex-member of the National Advisory Council. He is also the founder and general secretary of Foundation for Democratic Reforms, a public policy-based think tank in Hyderabad. Good morning, Dr. JP.
Morning, Keshav.
So the elections is an exciting time for US and the rest of the world. Do these elections matter for India and the rest of the world?
Every election we tend to believe is a very consequential election, but I think the current election is truly consequential globally, not only for America but for the whole world. We are in the midst of a COVID crisis, whether science and rationality and a pragmatic approach to control and to prevent infection will work or not. America, the establishment, the head of the American executive branch of government has taken a certain position, whereas the scientific approach gives a different conclusion. And in many ways, if America now decides this way or that way, that will determine the trajectory in many countries. So it's consequential. In terms of global trade and global cooperation, will nation states always compete and have conflicts? Is it a zero-sum game or is it a positive-sum game? Ultimately, nations do compete, sometimes fiercely. But is that a zero-sum game? Is somebody's gain necessarily somebody else's loss? Or there is some kind of a nation-to-nation cooperation, global cooperation that benefits everybody. Again, that's on test now. The third is, at a very existential level, the global warming. The anthropomorphic world that we have created, that our activities, our economic activity itself is now bringing about a dramatic change in nature to our own peril. And therefore, do we have a reason to come together and then quickly address it, or do we simply ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist? So on these three planes, I think this election is incredibly consequential. There's no question about it in my mind. But these are practical matters. From a democratic standpoint of view, America in many ways is a symbol of democracy, and its foundational principles have inspired many nations. And it's been a great example. And therefore, the way democracy is run in America, and it evolves both, they're going to be examined very closely. If American democracy is seen to be somewhat dysfunctional, then certainly it's very difficult to make a case for democracy in the world. China is already arguing, albeit in a very subtle manner. They're not talking about democracy or lack of democracy. They're saying basically our system works, yours doesn't. So if American system doesn't work, then certainly it will lead to certain consequences in the world. And I think at the very least, it's great fun to examine American elections, the discourse there, the things that are seemingly trivial for us, but that are incredibly important in their imagination there, but the things that are incredibly important that are being discussed and debated. And in some unexpected ways, how fledgling countries like India are perhaps doing better in managing our democracy, at least they are part of conduct of elections, compared to America. So I think some of these comparisons and contrasts are very interesting.
You are a lifelong student of democracy. So we'd like to hear from you the democratic evolution of the United States since its early days. They seem to have an advantage when compared to the other countries.
Certainly. See, history and longevity and the social and cultural movements in a society, once they create a platform for democratic decision-making and democratic organization, that becomes easier. In a country like India, for instance, despite our long history and even familiarity with notions of democracy at the grassroots level, whether it's the republics, the pre-Mauryan era, the Lichavis, the other Mahajanapadas, etc., or the Cholas local governments, or the village self-governance for centuries, somewhat in isolation with the larger polity. We've had that experience, but not in recent past. Therefore, our democratic experience is transplanted constitutionally by a group of wise leaders, elites, in the best sense of the term, the finest of India, with exposure to the best in the world. They have decided that we should organize in a different manner. Whereas in America, and to some extent in large parts of Europe, it is cultural, social and cultural. They went through all the Dark Ages, the Crusades, then the Renaissance, the Reformation, all those things. And as a part of that process, democracy became slowly more and more organized and deeper and deeper. We must remember, those of us who talk about democracy, until 1920, women had no right to vote anywhere in the world. America in 1920 and Britain in 1928. So it's a great evolution. In that sense, America has been a pioneer in many respects. As we all know, in Virginia state in 1619, the art of democracy in actual practice. There is no class division. There is a gender division, but there is no class division. For the first time, the landowners and the serfs, there is no serf actually, but everybody was equal. They all sat together and decided on leadership and the laws and the regulations in managing their communities. And we all know about the Mayflower, because they have to figure out what to do once they land in this great, exciting new colonies in this new continent. They all gathered together on board the ship and then elected impromptu leadership and then had a charter as to how they will conduct themselves. So these are the first shoots of democracy, universal franchise, but minus women. Women are not part of the polity, you must remember. In that sense, universal, but minus women. Blacks were still not there. The slavery came a little later. The indigenous population, they of course didn't matter because they were adversaries. They were never part of the community. But despite all the flaws, the local governments were remarkable. They continue to be remarkable. Not that everything was wonderful. There were many stories of a locally elected leader, a sheriff or a mayor, becoming an autocrat, a corrupt dictator, sometimes using brutal force to oppress the communities, etc. But that's human nature. Until democracy matures and we build institutional mechanisms to keep those in power under check, power will be abused, whether it's democratic or hereditary dictatorship, doesn't matter. But the evolution was remarkable. The building blocks of democracy, the freedom of speech, the universal franchise, the collective decision-making, representative democracy, and the serious discourse, debate. Lincoln's time, people used to say there used to be 6 to 8 hours public meetings, no microphone, remember. Lincoln's time, even a camera has come, but microphone was not there yet. So without a microphone, the leaders had to bellow, make themselves heard, and each one would speak for 2 hours, 3 hours. People would participate. They would raise questions, you would respond. And Tocqueville, when he went to the United States, he wrote that seminal book on democracy in America, how everybody was a member of some organization other outside his own trade or his own family. And how there was intense debate everywhere on large questions that plagued society at a point of time. So very intense culture of questioning, debating, discussing, resolving the issues, and finding a viable answer and then implementing. So in that sense, America has been a progenitor of many democratic institutions and values. And of course, there was the first written constitution, the first constitution with the separation of powers, clearly defined and articulated and actually practiced. The first federal democracy, again constitutionally ordained, and a nation that created many enduring instruments subsequently, innovative instruments. Many people may not realize the first presidential debates, candidates contesting, actually they happened as early as in the 1860s and 1850s. Lincoln-Douglas debates, not as presidential candidates, but for Senate, for the US Senate from the state of Illinois, were very famous. In fact, Lincoln became very famous because that it so happened that Douglas and Lincoln were the competitors for presidency subsequently in the 1860 election, which Lincoln won. So the debates even then were there. They were not called debates in the modern sense, but from 1960, you had the presidential debates actually coming on live television and then debating. So many innovative practices, the primary elections. A party in America is no longer anybody's private property. It has its own problems. A complete outsider like Donald Trump could come in and capture a political party and then create mayhem in the polity. But the fact is, it's democratic. If he has the sway over the people in the party, if they trust him and believe him and accept his message, he becomes the leader. Barack Obama was a very unknown entity. He became a leader in no time. So the internal democracy, the strongest instruments in the world, the primary elections in the choice of candidate. So there are many innovative tools, and in many ways, it shaped at least the last century. Democratic evolution and the way things happen not only in America but in the world. I've been following American elections since 1972, very intimately. I remember the 72 election. In my innocence, I thought there was actually an equal fight. There was no equal fight. I mean, Nixon simply hammered, I think Walter Mondale was the candidate at the time, if I'm not mistaken, or is George McGovern. 1972 was George McGovern, I think, Democratic Party. Walter Mondale was the vice presidential candidate. Nixon hammered him. But the process was so exciting. And American elections are not merely about electing a person, it's also about a discourse on issues, shaping attitudes, and then deciding what ultimately the people want. So in that sense, American democracy's evolution have been very exciting for America and very instructive for the rest of the world too.
Dr. JP, critics will say that it's just fortuitous that Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock instead of in Virginia, and that there was a huge Atlantic Ocean for the Britishers to control Americans who could question and ascertain the right. How do you see this situation?
No, you see, in history, many things are fortuitous. But in organizing ourselves as a society, we are not building in a vacuum. Each society, whether it's India or Europe or America, the American founding fathers or the pilgrims and the immigrants from Europe, they went A, out of economic compulsion, B, ideologically driven because they believed in freedom and liberty, C, most important perhaps, the religious liberty, the notion that we should not be oppressed by a monarch or somebody, and we must be able to practice our own understanding of religion unhindered. So they brought those values of fierce freedom, and of course the fact that you would cross the Atlantic in extremely inhospitable conditions to find a new life means you're already an adventurer, you're a survivor. You understand the art of working together. So that certainly shaped their institutions. But nothing is given. After all, the southern American continent had identical experience. Right? You had indigenous people, you had Europeans, there was intermixing of populations and so on and so forth. But democracy as we understand today, or even economic growth and prosperity, they have not flourished. Actually, if you notice, Southern America has always been much richer in terms of natural resources throughout history. Ever since human beings landed in the American continent about 14,000 years ago, it was Southern America that was richer. All the great empires, the Mayan, the Incans, no, they were all in Southern America, not in North America. North America was somewhat inhospitable. Canada and today's USA were not really very attractive. But how come the people who landed in the United States and Canada, in particular United States, they shaped the world and they created prosperity, and not in Southern America where there's so much more natural wealth. So there is human organization.
What are the outstanding features that you see in the development of leadership and orderly discourse in the present United States?
I don't know if there's any development of orderly discourse today, but there's been a tradition of rationalism, of debate and discussion, of openness, of freedom and freedom of choice. But perhaps what's happening now is, in some respects, there is no openness. If people are not willing to listen to each other, and if people are not willing to disagree without attributing motives to the adversary, then democracy fails. I think large segments of America, as in India, as in Turkey, as in many other countries in the world today, I'm sure Brazil comes into the same category, and many other countries, people are no longer listening to each other. Mahatma Gandhi is one of the foremost practitioners of a philosophy, and there are many great philosophers who said it before him. When I discuss with my adversary, first, if I'm an honest person, I must recognize the truth in him. He must recognize the truth in me. Then we'll figure out what are the differences and see where we can come together. But even honesty apart, basic humanity and humility apart, practical common sense dictates that I can persuade you if I accept the elements of your logic or your version of facts which I agree. Then we can look at disagreements. If the moment we have a slight disagreement and I treat you as my enemy, we fall into the trap of narcissism of small differences. We never get an agreement. And we polarize everything, and I attribute motives to my adversary. Just because I don't agree with him, his conclusions say, I have my facts and he has his facts. We are no longer agreeing on facts. First, if you recognize the facts, how to interpret the facts and derive lessons from that, we can debate. If facts are disputed, whether we are 10 people here or 100 people or 2 persons, whether the sun rises in the east or does not, whether the earth revolves around the sun or not, if the facts are disputed, argument is futile. And second, when you disagree in an argument, if you attribute motives to the opponent and say, because he doesn't agree with what I believe, then he is the worst of humanity and vice versa, then all democracy collapses. Democracy cannot be about voting and shouting. While a majority have a right to govern, constitutional values mean that you respect the adversary's rights. 2, pragmatic notions of running a society means that even if I have the right to make a decision, on each decision I take on board your point of view. I don't use brute majority in the legislative chambers to bulldoze you. Unfortunately, in America of today, the great lessons that they have practiced and they have taught to the rest of the world, democratic world, they are being forgotten. You take the gerrymandering of constituencies. In many states, if a political party has control over the state legislature, they are redistricting, as they call, drawing the boundaries of constituencies in a manner that a party will get a vast majority disproportionate to the popular support in that state. Look at the nomination and appointment, and today Justice Amy Barrett was sworn in as Supreme Court judge. The whole process and the different yardsticks you apply depending on who is in power or who is the candidate. There is no principle that is guiding you. Even when it comes to the August High Court, which is one of the fulcrums of American democratic framework, all these indicate that there is a high degree of polarization. Actually, you're practicing tribalism in the name of democracy. Whereas humankind evolved from tribalism to organized societies beyond tribes, eventually nationalism, and then democracy. Now, unfortunately, we are regressing in some respects, becoming hyper-tribal, except that this tribalism is not always, sometimes it is not always based on birth and color of the skin and race, but it is based on political beliefs also, in addition to birth and color of the skin and race and religion. It's also the political beliefs. We are completely living in different worlds, not willing to listen to each other. In that sense, American democracy is a very troubled one now. And it's also troublesome for the rest of the world, because American democracy's trajectory has profound consequences to all of us in the world.
Now that you've admitted there are troubles and problems with American democracy, let me take you a little bit further. A presidential candidate in the US may win presidency despite losing the popular vote. The Electoral College, a relic of the past, seems to be dominating the system. What is the importance and context of it now, the electoral college, in the modern democratic sense?
It is a bit archaic, or so it seems, but I have actually some sympathy for that cause. In a large federal democracy, when a heterogeneous population or populations are coming together, even in a country like the UK, we call 4 nations, do you remember? Even the UK's president, prime minister, he would talk about the 4 nations: England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. They recognize it. Now, in a country with 330 million population, a country with 1.4 billion population like ours or China, you're dealing with, whether you use the word nation or not. Sometimes nation has a very emotional connotation, but the sense of identity, sense of kinship, sense of sharing of common beliefs and practices and culture and history may not be there for a whole nation state which is a legal entity. Therefore, America, when they created the federation, initially the 13 colonies, when they came together, they decided, after a great deal of deliberation and with some good sense, that mere numerical majority or the largeness of certain provinces or certain constituent units of the federation should not be so dominant that ultimately the states' rights will be extinguished. So there's always a clash. Now, one extreme is that I will retain the right to continue slavery. That's why civil war was inevitable. Once you say states' rights beyond a point are valid. Now the accepted wisdom is there are certain fundamental constitutional values that are non-negotiable. No state can claim privileges beyond the constitutional values. That is the lesson of civil war. The second part is, subject to that, electorally some adjustments are made in order to give a level of comfort and assurance for the federation to coexist. I think it's reasonably okay. I'm sure each country will figure out its own mechanism. Look at India. For good or for bad, way back in 1975, Indian Parliament has frozen through a constitutional amendment the number of Loksatta seats in each state, irrespective of the census population. The Constitution quite rightly said that every 10 years, on the basis of the census, the number of seats allocated to a state in the Lok Sabha, House of the People, will be determined. Deliberately, the political leadership of the country, through a parliamentary enactment, has decided. There was no malice there. Now, whether the decision is wise or unwise is a different matter. There is no malice there. They have decided that they should be frozen so that the population growth will not be rewarded in a country where population explosion is one of the great dangers, an imminent danger. Now, that was continued in the next constitutional amendment for 25 years later, in the 2000s decade, until 2026. So, we have now a situation where the number of seats is not proportional to the population in each state. Now, it is a federal arrangement we made consciously. We have special category states, the distribution of unions' tax resources to certain states. They have a privileged position. Now, you're not treating all states as equal. There are 11 special category states which are getting a special dispensation. Again, the nation accepted it as part of the federal principle. You have Article 371D in case of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, A, B, C, etc. in case of other states, particularly in the northeast. We had earlier Article 370 in respect of J&K. These are special federal arrangements made in a complex polity. So this is, I think, common for all large, complex federal countries. If I don't think it is a fundamentally wrong thing, it's not right or wrong. It's more about a political negotiation and a necessity to give reassurance to the whole population, to see that the union lives together. Now, you must never create conditions in which a constituent part of the nation says, I would much rather be separate. You cannot always control them by brute force. And at the same time, you must never create conditions in which there will be so much of extreme disparity, whether in electoral representation or taxation or sharing of resources, that ultimately the union cannot hold together. Somewhere, you must strike that balance. I think America is finding its own way. Therefore, I don't think electoral college is a bad idea. I know it certainly is, for the time being, hurtful to the Democratic Party. Republicans have an advantage because there are many small states where they gain the governments in the states as well as the senatorial positions. and therefore electoral college, which also takes into account the Congress, which is based on population, plus the Senate, which is not based on population, and that distorts the outcome. But I think in the larger picture of holding a country together, an electoral college is not a bad idea.
Okay, JP, I still want to dwell on the faults and flaws in the American system. Just to elucidate.
Yeah, there are definite imperfections, and increasingly we realize that maybe there are some things where India is doing well relative to America, in conduct of elections at least.
Just to elucidate, the American candidates seem to be running to the courts. The famous case of 2000 election where George Bush was elected by the court, or in the latest case there seems to be a culture of vote suppression where the legal issues are being mired into the present context. This seems to be not as pronounced in India.
You're absolutely
can we draw some conclusions?
When you look back, it's actually a miracle. We took it for granted so far, but the way things are shaping up in the United States, it's a miracle that for the past 70 years, India had an impeccable record of orderly conduct of elections and peaceful transfer of power, which was never questioned. Indira Gandhi, with a massive popularity in the country and with the monopoly of power of a party for a long time, was defeated roundly in 1977. There was not even a whisper about the possibility of the Prime Minister not giving up office. That's true in every single instance. There is a peaceful transfer of power which is universally accepted. And two, there's a uniform application of rules in the conduct of elections. Now, what does it mean? Perhaps the notion of decentralization can be carried too far. I'm a great supporter of decentralization as a principle. But in creating a framework for conduct of elections, I think you have to have some uniform rules of the game. You cannot leave it to the sweet will of each state and county. American elections are not really one election. There are probably as many elections as there are counties in that country, and definitely as many elections as there are states in the country. Now, if you have so many electoral practices and laws and regulations, it's impossible to conduct. Confusion, inefficiency, and disputation. The second thing, India created some strong constitutional authorities. There are times when the Election Commission of India, in my judgment, is transgressing its authority. For instance, this prolonged election of 7 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 phases, 7 phases, it's absurd in my view. I've said it publicly and to the sitting chief election commissioners. But those circumstances apart, in a broader sense, the notion that there is an Election Commission of India, which is the custodian of all the electoral rolls. Therefore, there is no chance for a political party in power in each state or a regional local government or city deciding how the voter registers are manipulated. Of course, not that the politicians have no role. After all, you have the same machinery. But there is a mechanism by which the mistake can be corrected. And that is a transparent mechanism, a credible mechanism, an independent mechanism, a non-partisan mechanism. Even if sometimes the local employees, they work under the control of the local elected representatives and the elected governments, and therefore they are forced to act in ways which are less than fair. There is an independent mechanism. See, nothing can be perfect. In a large country, things are going to go wrong. But as long as you trust the process and the broad conduct of elections and the election conduct authorities, impartiality and credibility and competence, then all these distortions balance out. Some fellow in a village who has greater power, he will try to manipulate one way, another fellow elsewhere will manipulate the other way. By and large, they neutralize themselves. And we can always improve the process to make it as close to perfection as possible. But an independent authority which doesn't force you to go to courts. It's amazing that in America today, there are more than 300 cases pending. We are 7 days away from the election, where on next Tuesday, American election will be held. Actually, election already started about a month ago in many cases. Again, each state has its own date, very American. But already about 45% or 47%, I think, by today's estimate, of the total number of people who voted in the 2016 elections already voted, either in-person voting spread over many days or voting by mail. Probably by the time of the election, actual election date of November the 3rd, by current projections, probably 60% plus people would have already voted. Despite that, on a day-to-day basis, there are hundreds of cases at the state Supreme Court level, at the federal court level, federal appellate circuit court level, and the Supreme Court of United States level. And in fact, one of the reasons the President of the United States cited in nominating and appointing a judge of the Supreme Court in such a hurry during the election, while the election process is on, is that there will be many cases that will be going to courts about elections, and I want my own person there. It is amazing. It's unthinkable. So, you require a uniform framework for the whole country in the conduct of elections, not management of election. Management can still be local, but management of election must be completely supervised and directed by an independent authority like our election commission, including electoral rolls. And see, the courts must not be given a role at all. Indian courts, there are many cases, many instances when Indian courts have been somewhat reckless in interfering in executive functioning, but not in election management. They have acted superbly with exceptional, admirable restraint and wisdom ever since independence. The Indian Supreme Court has never interfered. In fact, the Supreme Court gave a general direction that as a general rule, once the election process has commenced, elections are notified, the courts shall stay away. After the election is over, if there are some serious irregularities that can be proven, you come to us to quash the election of somebody in an election petition which is constitutional and legally permissible. Admirable restraint of courts. In America, you don't see that. On the part of the parties or the people or the courts. And finally, our courts have their problems, we all know. I have been fighting for long that there is no way the Supreme Court can appoint itself. The collegium system is wrong. Every authority in the country must trace its legitimacy to the electoral process. They may not be elected, but they must be accountable to the elected bodies, representative bodies, because representative bodies alone get our sovereignty. They work on our behalf. The Supreme Court does not act on behalf of the citizens. It may act on behalf of the Constitution, but you're not accountable to me. So you have to be accountable to a process which ultimately can be traced to me as a voter and a citizen. The Supreme Court of India is wrong. But having said that, we have never seen the degree of politicization very overtly, very crudely, that we have seen in American courts. 200 judges in the federal courts appointed in the last 4 years, ramming through them because you have a majority in the upper house, because that's how the Constitution envisages it. The 6 out of 9 judges belong to a very strong conservative persuasion, very overtly so, stated publicly so. It's not hinted, it's not discreet, it's very open, overt, and stated publicly. And their actions in 90 to 95% cases show, irrespective of the merits of the case, the people appointed by a certain party act in a certain manner. The judges appointed by another party act in a certain manner. I think it's not particularly edifying. So I think all these 4 to me are important lessons. Lack of uniform framework, lack of independent authority, the propensity for litigation in election matters, even when the elections are going on, and the way the high courts are structured and the politicization of the courts. And whatever we say about our country, and there are many flaws, and I have been very vocal critic of what is wrong with our system, none of these 4 serious problems arise in India. We have our problems. But our constitution makers and our successive governments and political parties in some respects have been far wiser.
Dr. JB, now that you have mentioned Indian Election Commission, but the United States also has a Federal Election Commission.
It has a very marginal role. Federal Election Commission is only, if I'm not mistaken, about funding and funding laws implementation, whether the campaign finance has been spent for personal gain or something else. And it's comprised of 4 people, if I'm not mistaken again, two nominated by each political party. So it is meant to be a political body, but bipartisan political body. It is meant to be a toothless body in a broader sense. And therefore, the Federal Election Commission of the United States has nothing to do with the Indian Election Commission. I mean, these are worlds apart. Our Election Commission is about the strongest in the world. As I said, there are some areas where the Election Commission of India is transgressing that line. But in a broad sense, it served the country well. America has nothing equivalent to that.
Lately, there is an accusation of voter suppression, a culture of voter suppression. That seems to be on the rise in the United States. Don't we also have the same problem here in India?
No, you see, in any society which is unequal, where hierarchies exist, we have caste system, we have poverty, we have polarization in politics. Therefore, the strong, economically or politically or physically, will always try to suppress the voice of the weak. But are there institutional mechanisms to address that? For instance, our All India services, they function under the Election Commission for the purpose of voter registration and for election management. It's not that the administration is separate from the government, but for the purpose of election, it's completely separate from the government. And institutionally, our All India services, they have the strength. There are cases where they buckle under pressure. But because there's an election commission which is monitoring, supervising and directing and even controlling to the extent of monitoring elections, the distortions can be set right. Therefore, voter registration, while there are flaws in that, is generally a much more transparent process. The second thing is, in the US, the voter registration, each state has its own law. They make laws at will. For instance, America has the largest number of prisoners in jails, incarcerated. The vast majority of them are for non-violent, relatively trivial offenses. Like, for instance, in a society with enormous drug culture, many people consume small quantities of drugs, experimental or otherwise. If they are caught, it's a felony offense. They are all denied the right to vote in most states of America on the ground that they are great criminals, even after they completed the sentence. Now, this is used as a mechanism to suppress voting because most of the people so convicted are the poor people belonging to the African American race. So the local mechanisms are evolved to suppress it. It's not overtly stated, but the intent is very clear. Similarly, voter registration is mandated. That in a sense, I have to register myself as a voter. I don't automatically become a voter. Now, increasingly we realize the fallacy of that. In India, voter registration is done by the Election Commission. And if there is an error there, I can file a petition to correct it. Otherwise, I can simply sit at home, my name is still registered as a voter. And we actually have installed sufficient safeguards, in some of which in institutionalizing Loksatta movement played a significant role. The photo identity cards, and then on the voter list itself, the photo being printed. If you notice now, in the electoral roll itself, the voter's name, the photo also is printed. Therefore, the mischief is much less likely. And therefore, you don't have to come up with many other stratagems in the guise of preventing fraud, actually meant to suppress the voting. That's what America, the artful politicians in America keep doing, including, I think, the current president. He talks about voter fraud all the time, but the reality is far from that. But in India, you already created mechanisms. It's amazing that a country of America's wealth and technical sophistication cannot adopt some of the mechanisms we did. Why can't the electoral rolls have the photographs straight away mentioned? Why can't you have some other mechanisms? No, it's not that it's not possible. Because it's, 1,000 jurisdictions are acting on their own, it's becoming difficult. Take, for instance, the constituencies. That's another form of voter suppression. If the constituencies are so divided that everywhere a party which is dominant will have a narrow majority, but overall it will get disproportionate seats, irrespective of either a minority or a small majority in the country or the state, that is gerrymandering. America is famous for that. The state legislature has the complete power of redistricting, as they call it. In India, it is done by habitually, after every census or whenever the delimitation, as we call in India, is due, we create a delimitation commission And our founding fathers created a mechanism by which a Supreme Court judge chairs it, an election commission member is a member, other political parties and their representatives are involved, but ultimately the decisions are made transparently according to certain criteria, and gerrymandering is simply not possible. I'm not saying everything is perfect. Certainly, influential politicians can influence the decision making there also. But that impact is marginal and it neutralizes each other. So there are some institutions and practices which I think we have to again revisit in India. We have taken them for granted. We have underestimated the strength of some of our institutions. Yes, our elections are a mess because vote buying, freebies, not really delivering what the government should be delivering to the people and enhancing people's capacities, and divisions in society, creating a polarized society, which is true with America also now. I don't think India is worse than America in the third respect. The first two are not there. These are all huge problems. There's no question about it. But the conduct of elections part, otherwise I think India probably could not have survived even as a functioning democracy, of having free and fair elections, peaceful transfer of power, of the rights of people being respected in general in a broad sense, of winners not punishing losers. And imagine the American president saying, jail them because they're my opponents. That's a language one never thought we would hear from America. It's unthinkable, a country wedded to rule of law. Our rule of law is in a mess. But even then, it is rare that our senior politicians say, I will put the opponent in jail tomorrow, or jail that fellow. Occasionally it is said, but it's frowned upon, and generally, we have seen massive changes of governments, but in general, there has been remarkable decorum in that. So I think in some respects, we haven't done too badly. I'm not being smug or being unconscious of our failings. I am very conscious of our failings. In fact, I am the sharpest voice in India, one of the sharpest voices in India about the failings of our democracy. But we must also recognize some of our strengths, and that must give us confidence that we can set things right. There's nothing written in stone. And if we act quickly and adopt the best practices elsewhere and reject the bad practices, we can improve. Take, for instance, the gun culture. In America, it's anathema that you would say people should not have guns as a rule. I am delighted that in India, all parties and the society have taken a position that a general rule is that people should not carry guns. Only as an exception, after a very diligent process, will people be allowed to carry guns. I think this is a good practice. We should be happy about that. So we don't have to imitate another country slavishly or blindly. I think that is the lesson of this whole exercise. And you look at America today in particular, there are ways in which we are actually doing better. But there are obviously ways in which they are doing much, much better. There's no comparison. We have to learn from them. But it should not be a very blind imitation.
Sir, I'll come to a very important issue. It's the big gorilla in the room that nobody wants to talk about. And this is about money in politics. I had the privilege to attend a book release function on understanding political corruption in India by a famous author. There at that function, most of the elders alluded that both US and India were same as far as political corruption was concerned. Do you think most of us
they're talking rubbish without being squeamish? They're talking rubbish. American elections are very costly, no question about it. If I take the American House of Representatives, the lower house of the American quote-unquote parliament, Congress, they have only 2-year tenure. Poor chaps have to go back to the voters every 2 years. And elections are very costly there. We'll come to the cost of it later. And therefore, from the day they are sworn in as members of the Congress, they have to keep on raising money for the next election. So there are some things which are pretty unhappy there. But every dollar and dime spent is raised legitimately, raised transparently, and utilized for legitimate election purposes. You must understand the difference. Most of it goes for television campaigning. For instance, in the last 1 week, both Trump and Biden probably are spending, I'm just giving a ballpark number, last 1 week alone, they must be spending about $200 to $250 million across the United States for the presidential election alone. Almost all of it for television advertising. Some of it goes for social media, some of it goes for the polls, because they take polls every day, they do focus groups and all kinds of sophisticated tools, etc. But it is for legitimate purposes and transparently declared. Indian money, only 10% goes towards actual campaign finance, legitimate campaign expenditure, which is a necessary expenditure. I've been always arguing. Politics is a noble endeavor. Political activity should be funded in some process or the other. Therefore, treating politics as dirty and not funding it is a terrible idea. But only 10% is a legitimate political activity. 90% money, broadly speaking, is spent on buying votes illegitimately with cash or other kinds of gifts, or hiring hoodlums to threaten others and to distort the process. So to say that these two are the same is absurd. It's absurd. But in India, Loksatta movement worked very hard after the Tehelka scam. We worked with all political parties. Again, I salute all political parties. Those in power at the time, NDA, those out of power at the time, the Congress and other parties. They all came together at our urging. And unanimously a law was enacted to create a legitimate window for funding the legitimate activities of politics, provided it is transparently funded, and the donor gets a 100% tax exemption. Many people may not realize it. It was our advocacy at that time. And I'm very happy, I salute them for that. The problem is not that part of it. The problem is the illegitimate part of it. And we have not even created a culture for even the legitimate funding, because only some of it is going in the legitimate way. But otherwise, even legitimate election costs or political management costs, they are collected by cash. Mr. Arun Jaitley, who was the minister at the time when this law was enacted, and I worked very closely with him and Sri L.K. Advani at that time, and Dr. Manmohan Singh and others across the spectrum, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, the then Defense Minister, George Fernandez, and many, many others. Arun Jaitley told me several times, no, look, you fought for it and we got the law enacted. But when BJP decided that they will not receive money by cash, only by check we'll receive as a party, though we were in power, when he was in power, he was telling me at that time in Vajpayee's comment, our collections dropped by 80-90% overnight. Because we have no system of rule of law. The fear is, if I am seen to be funding a political party, even for legitimate political activity, then the other political parties will take it out on me. There will be retribution. Because my economic fortunes are linked to the political power. In America, that fear is not there. Donald Trump, he may behave almost like a third world dictator on occasion, but he cannot and he could not punish people because they funded his rival party. In fact, today his rival has raised more money and is spending more money openly than the President of the United States. So laws can do only this much. Building a mechanism of rule of law, this is outside the election management, and creating a culture where you honestly and frankly support whichever philosophy or party or agenda that you like without fear of retribution. That is something where we are incredibly bad and America is way above us. So just because we're discussing some of the follies of American democracy in election management, let's not pretend that they and us are on the equal footing in many respects. No, not at all. They are a very evolved democracy in many respects, and our money management in elections is a disaster. I have no other expression. It's a disaster.
Sir, to dwell on democracy, there seems to be a big flaw even in India and US. First, past the post system, where a person that gets one more vote than the rival takes the whole of the constituency, seems to be unfair. Both India and US adopted. Do we have another alternative we can look at?
No, in the US actually it has not become detrimental, the first past the post part of it. Two things happened. One is they have separation of powers. Therefore, it's not merely the parliamentary majority, and also there are much more frequent elections for the lower house of Congress and every 4 years for the presidency. Therefore, because each organ is keeping the others in check, they're jealously guarding their own turf. And because of the maturity of democracy in other respects that we discussed, the first past the post system has not done damage to them in that respect, in that way. Because the power is decentralized substantially, states and local governments, and horizontally there's deconcentration of power, and there's a culture of rule of law, etc., etc. But that's largely a function of culture evolved and the separation of powers. It's much worse in India, because once you have somehow or other legislative office that is translated into direct or indirect executive power. In America, it doesn't matter whether the whole of Congress says yes or no, the president still can do whatever she or he thinks right in the executive branch of government, subject to the constitutionality of it. The second thing is, in America, they evolved a two-party system, largely because of direct election to the executive. When the executive is focused in one single person at each level, more than two parties is meaningless because you're futile. Therefore, it became ultimately a two-party system. Though the multiple parties from time to time existed on paper, in reality they are not consequential. Whereas in our system, it became a multiple-party system. Therefore, a first-past-the-post system became a highly disproportionate system with distorted incentives. Therefore, in America, I don't know if there is a strong case for switching over. Probably there isn't, because on the whole the system is working. The problems are there. It is not because of the electoral system, it's because of election management and a few other factors. Whereas in India, I think now a stage has come and we should completely relook at it, because the fundamental drivers of electoral success in India, the big money power to buy the vote for illegitimate purposes, the distortion of incentives to the voters, focusing on the short-term freebies at the cost of the long-term public good that the government should be promoting with our tax money, and the tribalization of society and polarization of society, all these can be overcome only if we switch over either to a separation of powers model like in America, a direct election of the executive branch of government with enormous decentralization and a lot of other safeguards, or, and it can be and or, a proportional representation system very carefully designed so that you don't have very extreme voices finding representation. There are mechanisms of doing that, having a reasonable threshold, etc., etc. But definitely first-past-the-post system with a parliamentary executive Westminster model that we have in our conditions, where the link between the vote and the consequences to a person's life are not clearly understood, it has been extremely dysfunctional. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever. If you want quickly to transform Indian politics, make it really ennobling and very positive for the country, then electoral system change is the easiest way, and there is a broad consensus in the country. The political parties must be willing to bite the bullet.
Dr. JP, you are not just a physician by training, but a physician at heart who always looks and champions for universal health care. One of the candidates, Mr. Joe Biden, is promising expanded healthcare and affordable healthcare in the United States. Is this a real possibility?
I don't know, but eventually I think the system will drive it. They're taking it unduly long time because the uniqueness of American culture and American public discourse. But I think in today's world, every civilized human being and a civilized political party accepts health as a human right, without having to impose an enormous burden on the pocket, on the finances of a family. And if some reasonable quality of health is not assured, then the government is simply not performing its function. And America is a great country, worthy of emulation in many respects, and the world got so much from America in terms of technology, ideas, democracy, values, human rights, etc. But America is pretty dismal in some respects. The gun culture, which they somehow are not willing to address as a society, and therefore the fear everywhere. It's not merely the number of people who are dying or being shot at, the fear. Even the police excesses, I suspect, in many cases are because of the potential, the fear of the potential violence from the person to be apprehended. Every citizen you encounter, if you see as a person with potentially carrying a loaded weapon and therefore killing you or harming you, if that's the way the policeman enters the job, the policeman is a human being. Every human being wants to protect herself and himself. That's perfectly normal. The fear for your own safety is a natural thing. If every policeman is scared because the person you apprehend, a citizen, is potentially carrying a weapon and therefore might kill you, then the whole life is different. No, that's not being discussed by either party. Healthcare, for a country with so much of technical sophistication and wealth and innovation in healthcare, that they give such shoddy healthcare to their people at the bottom of the pyramid, is really not an edifying example of a great society. Absence of public transport in many cases, if you don't have personalized transport, if you lose your driving license, if you're alone somewhere, it's almost like death sentence for many people. I think there are some things that America should probably learn from Europe. There are some things we should unlearn from America.
And healthcare is one of them.
Healthcare is certainly one of them.
Yes, that is a big discussion even in the presidential election and the sentiment of the people. One important question that most Indians would like to know from a political standpoint: if elected President Biden, how would the relationship, do you think, would be with India now that Prime Minister Modi had a better relationship with President
No, see,
Trump?
these are all Prime Minister or a particular president pretending that you have a personal relationship, therefore nations work together. It's a very facile notion. Great nations have great interests, complex interests. There's a complex interplay, and we are on the lookout for our interests, they are on the lookout for their interests. But happily, irrespective of which party is in power, India and the United States have tremendous synergy economically, socially, technologically, militarily, strategically. There is very little area of discord between the two nations. There are going to be some. So we are also a growing economy, we have aspirations, trade and others, there will be some minor disagreements. But on the whole, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, India has a serious interest in America, and I suspect America has a serious interest in India's future. And both want each other's greatness because both benefit from each other, not because they love each other, because there is a common interest. That I am confident. If you recall, Barack Obama came for our Republic Day. The only American president who spent endless hours, boring hours there watching the parade. It was a signal to India. George Bush Jr. was a great friend of India's. He may have been very unpopular in much of the rest of the world, but he was hugely popular in India. Clinton's speech in Indian Parliament was one of the most celebrated speeches. The members of Parliament behaved like crazed fans trying to shake hands with the president and take his signature or something. So irrespective of which party is in power, earlier era was different. But in the current era, there is a complete synergy between the Indian interest and American interest. Therefore, which party is in power, in that sense, is immaterial to us. But what kind of leadership they project and what kind of values they articulate and what kind of broader policies they have great consequences to us and the rest of the world. There's no doubt about it.
Finally, sir, in a lighter vein, who do you think will win and who do you want to win?
We are not voters in America. Whoever wins, we want good relationship with them. But certainly, from a democratic standpoint of view, human rights standpoint of view, collective global interest standpoint of view, global cooperation standpoint of view, the current establishment in Washington, D.C. has been an aberration. There is a certain trajectory in the past 25, 30 years. The United States has been articulating the need for global cooperation, a common set of rules of the game, global trade, and a broader sense of rule of law and rule by regulation, and an effort to find technological and institutional economic solutions to global warming and other challenges, and free trade across the world. The current establishment has taken a 180-degree trajectory, and China, a totalitarian and authoritarian dictatorship, is seen increasingly a greater champion of some of these global values than America. I don't think it's good for democracy. If an authoritarian country is seen as a champion of some of the democratic values and values of global cooperation, that's not in the interest of India, not in the interest of the world. So in that sense, whoever is temporarily wielding the reins of power in Washington, D.C., I think must set the course right.
Thank you, Dr. JP, for taking time